There, sitting on a muddy German airfield in May 1945, were rows of the most advanced aircraft he'd ever laid eyes on. The young American pilot couldn't believe what he was seeing. Sleek jets that looked like they'd flown straight out of a science fiction magazine. Some had swept wings. Others had no propellers at all, just smooth noses and strange engine pods. These machines represented a technology so far ahead of anything the Allies possessed that it seemed impossible. Within days, a secret scramble would begin across the shattered remains of Nazi Germany, with American, British, and Soviet forces racing against each other to grab every jet, every blueprint, and every German scientist they could find. What happened next would shape the entire future of aviation and help determine which nations would dominate the skies for the next half-century. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Nazi regime left behind approximately 5,000 aircraft of various types scattered across occupied territories. Among these were roughly 1,400 of their revolutionary jet fighters and bombers, the Messerschmitt Me 262s, Heinkel He 162s, and Arado Ar 234s that had terrorized Allied bomber crews in the final months of the war. But these weren't just ordinary war prizes. These jets represented a quantum leap in aviation technology that would make whoever possessed them the masters of post-war air power. The challenge was that Germany itself had been carved into zones of occupation, with American, British, French, and Soviet forces each controlling different regions. The jets were spread everywhere, hidden in forests, buried in caves, stashed in factories, and sitting exposed on damaged airfields. The race to claim them became one of the most dramatic treasure hunts in military history. The Americans moved first and moved fast. Within hours of Germany's surrender, special technical intelligence teams were already fanning out across the American zone, armed with lists of locations where German aircraft and research facilities might be found. These weren't regular soldiers, they were engineers, scientists, and aviation experts who understood exactly what they were looking for. Operation Lusty, which stood for Luftwaffe Secret Technology, had actually begun weeks before the official surrender, as Allied forces captured German territory. The operation's goal was simple: find every advanced aircraft, every research document, every wind tunnel, and every German aviation expert before the Soviets could get to them. The Americans knew that their wartime ally was about to become their peacetime rival, and whoever controlled German jet technology would have an enormous advantage. The crown jewel everyone wanted was the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Germany had built approximately 1,400 of these revolutionary aircraft, though only about 200 to 300 had seen combat at any one time due to fuel shortages and the constant Allied bombing of German infrastructure. The Me 262 was breathtakingly fast. It could reach speeds of 540 miles per hour, about 120 miles per hour faster than the best Allied fighters. Its 430mm cannons could shred a bomber with a single burst, and some versions carried air-to-air rockets. Allied pilots who encountered these jets described them with a mixture of awe and terror. The problem for the Allies during the war was simple: you couldn't catch what you couldn't catch up to. Now, with Germany defeated, hundreds of these jets sat waiting to be claimed. The Americans found entire squadrons of Me 262s at bases throughout Bavaria and central Germany. Some were intact and flyable. Others had been deliberately damaged by retreating German forces trying to keep them out of enemy hands. Still others had simply run out of fuel during their last missions and been abandoned by pilots who knew the war was lost. American technical teams worked around the clock to identify which aircraft were in the best condition. They selected the finest examples, had them carefully disassembled by German mechanics who were now working under Allied supervision, and prepared them for shipment back to the United States. By the summer of 1945, American transport ships were carrying Me 262s across the Atlantic, where they would be reassembled and tested at places like Wright Field in Ohio, the Navy's test facility in Patuxent River, Maryland, and other secret locations. The British were equally aggressive in their hunt for German jets, though they had different priorities and methods. The Royal Air Force had been on the receiving end of Me 262 attacks and understood intimately how dangerous these aircraft were. British intelligence teams swept through the northern portions of Germany that fell under British occupation, seizing not just aircraft but entire factories. At Farnborough, the Royal Aircraft Establishment, British engineers would eventually test and examine dozens of German jets. The British were particularly interested in the engines, The Junkers Jumo 004 turbojets that powered most German jets were crude by later standards, with a service life of only about 25 hours before requiring replacement, but they represented a working solution to problems British engineers were still struggling with. Every captured engine was carefully studied, measured, and tested to destruction to understand its secrets. One of the most remarkable discoveries came at a factory in Thuringia, in central Germany. There, British forces found not just completed aircraft but entire production lines for the Heinkel He-162, a jet fighter that the Germans had designed to be built quickly using semi-skilled labor and non-strategic materials. The He-162, nicknamed the Volksjäger or People's Fighter, was an act of desperation, a jet fighter made largely of wood, simple enough that it could be mass-produced in furniture factories. The British were astounded by its design. Here was a jet fighter that could be built in just 90 days from raw materials to finished aircraft. Thousands had been ordered, though only about 320 were completed before the war ended. The British seized every He-162 they could find, along with the factory equipment, the plans, and the workers who knew how to build them.
The problem was that Thuringia, where many of these factories were located, had been designated as part of the Soviet occupation zone according to the agreements made by the Allied powers at Yalta. This created a bizarre situation where British and American forces occupied territory they knew they would have to hand over to the Soviets within weeks. The result was an intelligence operation that bordered on looting. Working day and night, Allied teams stripped factories of everything valuable they could move: aircraft, engines, machine tools, documents, and scientists. Entire research facilities were dismantled and shipped west before the Soviets could arrive. In some cases, British and American teams destroyed what they couldn't take, denying it to the Soviets rather than leave it behind. This created enormous resentment among the Soviet forces, who arrived to find empty factories and burned documents. The Soviets, however, were not caught completely empty-handed. The Red Army captured enormous territories in eastern Germany, including important research centers and production facilities around Berlin. At these locations, they found their own collection of German jets, including Me-262s, He-162s, and the Arado Ar 234 bomber, another jet-powered aircraft that the Germans had used for high-speed reconnaissance missions that Allied fighters couldn't intercept. The Soviets also captured something perhaps more valuable than the aircraft themselves: thousands of German engineers, technicians, and scientists who had worked on these projects. Unlike the Americans and British, who carefully selected which Germans they wanted to recruit, the Soviets took a more comprehensive approach. Entire design bureaus were transported, personnel and all, to the Soviet Union. The most dramatic episode in this technological scramble involved the German scientists themselves. The Americans launched Operation Paperclip, a program designed to bring German scientists and engineers to the United States before the Soviets could capture them. The operation's name came from the paperclips attached to the files of those scientists deemed most valuable. Among the aviation experts recruited were men like Hans Multhaup, who had worked on swept-wing designs at Messerschmitt, and Alexander Lippisch, whose research into delta wings and tailless aircraft would influence American aviation for decades. These men brought with them not just their knowledge but crates of documents, research data, and experimental results that would have taken the Allies years to reproduce independently. The ethical complications of Operation Paperclip were enormous and controversial. Many of the German scientists recruited had been members of the Nazi Party. Membership was often required to hold senior technical positions in wartime Germany. Some had used slave labor from concentration camps in their factories. The American government made a calculated decision that the value of their knowledge outweighed these concerns, especially given the emerging tensions with the Soviet Union. The scientists' Nazi affiliations were downplayed or hidden in official records, and they were brought to the United States where they would work on American military projects. This decision would haunt American policy for decades, but in the immediate aftermath of the war, the focus was entirely on gaining every possible advantage over the Soviets. Back in the United States, the captured German jets began arriving at test facilities throughout 1945 and 1946. At Wright Field in Ohio, American test pilots climbed into Me-262 cockpits and experienced for themselves what it meant to fly at jet speeds. The results were illuminating and humbling. The Me-262 was faster than anything the Americans had, but it was also difficult to fly, mechanically unreliable, and had handling characteristics that could be lethal to inexperienced pilots. The engines were temperamental. Advancing the throttle too quickly could cause compressor stalls that would destroy the engine or even cause fires. Landing was treacherous because the aircraft had to maintain high speeds to stay airborne, making runway approaches fast and unforgiving. Yet despite all these flaws, the Me-262 proved that jet propulsion was the future of military aviation. American engineers tore apart the captured jets, examining every component. They studied the engine designs, measured the airframes, tested the materials, and analyzed the aerodynamics. What they found was that German engineering had solved problems through brute force and clever improvisation rather than through superior metallurgy or manufacturing. The Jumo 004 engines used low-quality steel alloys because Germany had been starved of strategic materials like chromium and nickel. The turbine blades wore out quickly because they operated at higher temperatures than the materials could really handle. But the Germans had made it work through ingenious design choices that compensated for material shortages. These lessons would prove invaluable as American engineers developed their own jet engines. The British program to exploit German jet technology followed a parallel path. At Farnborough and other facilities, British engineers conducted extensive tests on captured Me-262s, He-162s, and AR-234s. The British aircraft industry was already working on its own jets. The Gloucester Meteor had entered service with the RAF in 1944, making Britain the only Allied nation with operational jet fighters during the war. However, the Meteor was relatively conservative in design, with straight wings and engines mounted in the wings rather than in a fuselage. The German jets showed the British engineers alternative approaches that might offer better performance. The swept wings of late-war German research aircraft were particularly intriguing, as they promised to delay the onset of compressibility problems that occurred as aircraft approached the speed of sound. British test pilots flew the captured German jets extensively, pushing them to their limits and beyond. Some of these flights ended in crashes as the unfamiliar aircraft revealed their quirks and vices. Others provided crucial data about high-speed flight that would inform the next generation of British jet fighters. The experience gained from flying German jets influenced the design of British aircraft like the Hawker Hunter and the English Electric Lightning, both of which incorporated lessons learned from German research. The British also shared some of their findings with the Americans through the technical cooperation agreements that existed between the two nations, though both sides kept certain secrets to themselves. The Soviets pursued their own program of exploitation with characteristic thoroughness and secrecy. Hundreds of German jets were transported to the Soviet Union, where they were tested at facilities around Moscow and other locations. Soviet test pilots, many of them veterans of brutal combat against the Luftwaffe, climbed into German cockpits and evaluated the captured technology. The Soviets were particularly interested in the Me-262 and also in more experimental designs like the rocket-powered Messerschmitt Me 163 interceptor. Soviet engineers dismantled engines, measured every dimension, and analyzed every design choice. Unlike the Americans and British, who had their own nascent jet programs, the Soviets were starting almost from scratch. German technology gave them a crucial shortcut. The Soviets took a more direct approach to acquiring German expertise than the Western Allies. Entire German design teams were relocated to the Soviet Union, sometimes voluntarily but often under compulsion. These Germans found themselves working in facilities in the Soviet Union, designing aircraft for their former enemies. The arrangement was uncomfortable for everyone involved, but it was effective. German engineers worked on Soviet jet programs throughout the late 1940s, helping to bridge the gap between Soviet aeronautical capabilities and those of the West. By the early 1950s, when most of these Germans were finally allowed to return to Germany, they had helped the Soviets develop their first generation of jet fighters and bombers. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the captured German jets was not the aircraft themselves but the research data that came with them. The Germans had conducted extensive wind tunnel testing of swept-wing designs, studying how aircraft behaved at high speeds approaching the speed of sound. This research had been compiled into thousands of documents that were captured by the Allies. American engineers studying these documents realized that swept wings offered major advantages for high-speed flight. They delayed the formation of shock waves that created drag and could cause aircraft to become uncontrollable. This discovery would revolutionize aircraft design. Within a few years, almost every new jet fighter and bomber featured swept wings, from the American F-86 Sabre to the Soviet MiG-15 to the British Hawker Hunter. The influence of German research extended beyond swept wings. German work on delta wing designs, where the wing forms a triangle with the fuselage, inspired a whole family of aircraft including the American F-102 and F-106 interceptors and, much later, the Anglo-French Concorde supersonic airliner. German research into wing loading, control surfaces, and high-speed aerodynamics saved the Americans, British, and Soviets years of expensive and dangerous research. In a very real sense, the jet age was built on a foundation of German research captured in 1945. Not all of the captured German jets survived long enough to make it to museums. Many were flown until they crashed or wore out. Others were deliberately destroyed in tests designed to understand their limits. Some were used as target drones, shot down by gunners learning to engage jet speed targets. A few were simply scrapped when they were no longer needed. But enough survived to fill museums around the world today. You can see Me-262s at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, at the Deutsches Museum in Munich, at the RAF Museum in London, and at many other institutions. These aircraft stand as testament to German engineering achievement and to one of the most dramatic technology transfers in history. The French also got into the game, though later than the others. France had been occupied during most of the war and had no jet program of its own. As French forces occupied their zone of Germany, they too began seizing German aircraft and equipment. The French were particularly interested in the Junkers Jumo 004 engines, which they studied intensively. French engineers eventually built copies of these engines and used them to power France's first jet aircraft. The French also recruited German engineers, though in smaller numbers than the Americans, British, or Soviets. French aviation would eventually develop its own character and capabilities, but in the crucial years immediately after the war, German technology gave France a way to catch up. The diplomatic tensions created by this technological scramble were significant. The Soviets accused the Western Allies of violating the spirit of their alliance by stripping factories before handing territory over to Soviet control. The Americans and British responded that they were simply claiming legitimate war prizes. Behind these diplomatic disputes lay a harder reality. The wartime alliance was dissolving, and the former allies were now competitors in a new kind of conflict. The Cold War was beginning, and control of German jet technology was one of its first battlegrounds. The jets themselves became symbols of the competition between East and West, with both sides rushing to develop their own improved versions of what the Germans had pioneered. By 1947, the Americans had gathered enough information from captured German jets to move beyond simply copying them. American companies like Lockheed, North American, and Republic were designing new fighters that incorporated German research but pushed beyond it. The North American F-86 Sabre, which would become famous in the Korean War, used a swept-wing design directly inspired by German research. When the F-86 first flew in 1947, it looked nothing like the straight-wing jets that had preceded it. The German influence was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. The Sabre would go on to fight against Soviet-built MiG-15s over Korea, and that battle was, in a sense, a contest between two different interpretations of German research, as both aircraft owed their swept wings to German wind tunnel data. The Soviets had followed a parallel path. The MiG-15, which appeared in 1948, also featured swept wings derived from German research. Soviet engineers had studied captured German jets and documents intensively, extracting every useful insight they could find. The MiG-15 was a remarkable achievement for Soviet aviation, representing a quantum leap forward from the propeller-driven fighters the Soviets had flown during World War II. When American pilots first encountered MiG-15s over Korea in 1950, they were shocked by how advanced the Soviet jet was. The performance of the MiG-15 made it clear that the Soviets had successfully exploited German technology to catch up with and, in some areas, surpass Western capabilities. The British, meanwhile, had developed their own family of swept-wing jets informed by German research. Aircraft like the Hawker Hunter and later the English Electric Lightning showed how British designers had absorbed German lessons about high-speed flight and combined them with British engineering traditions. The British had an advantage in that they had been working on jet engines longer than anyone except the Germans. Frank Whittle's pioneering work predated German jet development. But German research into airframe design helped British engineers optimize their aircraft for high-speed performance. Some of the captured German jets found their way into unexpected places. Several South American countries acquired German jets in the late 1940s, either through direct purchase or through complex deals involving German engineers who had fled to South America after the war. Argentina, in particular, became a destination for German aviation experts, and Argentine factories would eventually produce jet aircraft based heavily on German designs. These aircraft were never particularly successful, but they showed how German technology had spread beyond the major powers. The most advanced German jet designs never made it into production. The Horten Ho 229, a flying wing jet fighter that looked decades ahead of its time, existed only as prototypes when the war ended. American forces captured the incomplete third prototype and shipped it to the United States, where it was studied intensively. The flying wing concept would later be revived in American stealth aircraft like the B-2 bomber, though whether there's a direct link to the German research remains debated. Other experimental German jets like the Focke-Wulf Ta-183, which existed only as mock-ups and wind tunnel models, influenced post-war designs in both East and West. The Ta-183's design bore a striking resemblance to the Soviet MiG-15, leading to persistent speculation that Soviet engineers had access to the German plans. By the early 1950s, the first generation of captured German jets had mostly disappeared from frontline use. They had served their purpose as test beds and technology demonstrators, and now they were being replaced by aircraft designed from the ground up to incorporate the lessons they had taught. The Me-262s, He-162s, and AR-234s that had once represented the cutting edge of aviation were obsolete, overtaken by aircraft that flew faster, higher, and farther. But their influence remained. Every jet fighter and bomber that flew in the 1950s and beyond owed something to German research: a wing sweep angle tested in a German wind tunnel, an engine configuration pioneered by German engineers, or an aerodynamic principle discovered by German researchers. The fate of the individual aircraft varied widely. Some ended up in museums, carefully preserved as historical artifacts. Others were scrapped for parts or melted down for their metal. A few continued flying for years, used as test aircraft or trainers. One Me-262 was rebuilt to flying condition in the 1990s using original engines and now performs at air shows, giving modern audiences a chance to see what once seemed like science fiction made real. Most of the thousands of German jets that existed in 1945, however, simply vanished, broken up, burned, abandoned, or lost to the ravages of time and weather. The human stories behind the German jets were equally complex. The German pilots who had flown these aircraft during the war found themselves in a strange position. Many were interrogated by Allied intelligence officers eager to learn about the jet's capabilities and limitations. Some German pilots were recruited to work for the Allies, sharing their expertise and sometimes even flying captured jets to demonstrate their characteristics. Others simply went home to try to rebuild their lives in a defeated and divided Germany. The German engineers who had designed the jets faced difficult choices: collaborate with the occupying powers, try to continue their work under new masters, or abandon aviation entirely. Many chose collaboration, reasoning that their skills were needed and that working for the Americans, British, or Soviets was better than unemployment in a devastated country. For the Allied pilots and engineers who worked with the captured jets, the experience was often thrilling but sobering. They had won the war, but they had to confront the fact that their enemies had been ahead of them in some crucial technologies. This realization drove home the importance of maintaining technological superiority and investing in research and development. The captured German jets became symbols of what could happen if a nation fell behind in the race for military innovation. This lesson would shape military procurement and research priorities for decades to come, contributing to the massive investments in aerospace technology that characterized the Cold War. The story of what happened to Hitler's fighter jets is, in the end, a story about how technology transcends politics and borders. The jets themselves were products of Nazi Germany's war machine, built partly by slave labor and intended for conquest and oppression. But the knowledge they embodied, the aerodynamic principles, the engineering solutions, the research data, was politically neutral. That knowledge could be used by democracies as easily as by dictatorships. The race to capture German jets was really a race to capture knowledge, and the winners of that race gained advantages that would shape the world for generations. The jets themselves eventually rusted or were broken up, but what they taught lived on